Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder. And last time, Ulysses S. Grant advanced on Fort Donelson and attacked the fortifications with infantry, along with help from his navy on the Cumberland River. Those attacks failed, but that wasn't the end of the fighting around Donelson. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of our online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The Confederate and Union soldiers inside and outside of Fort Donelson awoke on February 14th to a layer of snow on the ground. Indeed, virtually all of them shivered through the night next to the fires, or for those who lacked those, endured the frigid night as comfortably as possible. Union General Ulysses S. Grant ordered all of his troops to skirmish with the enemy, but not to launch an assault. He hoped to force the Confederates to surrender, just like he had Fort Henry, through his superior navy. Confederate General John B. Floyd, the fort's commander, as well as his officers and men, expected a large infantry assault as they waited in their trenches, but none came, aside from a few skirmish lines approaching one another. The day was fairly quiet until Flag Officer Andrew Foote unleashed his flotilla on the Confederate garrison at Fort Donelson. As soon as the gunboats came within view, each side began to throw artillery rounds. Foote's gunboats approached the fort four abreast, with two timberclads behind, lobbing shells over the ironclads. The inexperienced rebel gunners experienced problems as they engaged in the artillery duel, but quickly learned their roles and fired back with great accuracy. They did encounter problems as they fired their guns, but they dealt incredible damage to the gunboats, one of the most significant for the battle itself being the rounds that destroyed the pilot house on the flagship St. Louis, killing the pilot. The rounds also wounded Andrew Foote, ironically, in the foot. A Union sailor on the gunboat remembered when a shell burst in the barrel of the artillery piece he was working on. For about 2 minutes I was stunned, and at least 5 minutes elapsed before I could tell what was the matter. When I found out that I was more scared than hurt, although suffering from the gunpowder which I inhaled, I looked forward and saw our gun lying on the deck, split in 3 pieces. He went on to describe the horrific scene aboard his ironclad, the enemy shells taking flagstaffs and smokestacks and tearing off the side armor as lightning tears the bark from a tree. Before the decks were well sanded, there was so much blood on them that our men could not work the guns without slipping. One by one, the damage dealt to the gunboats forced the ironclads to withdraw from the battle. It was an incredible victory for the Confederates, who figured what happened to Fort Henry would happen to them, and there was probably a lot of overconfidence on the part of Foote, who thought he may be able to reduce Donelson like he had Henry. The Confederates initially weren't going to sit idle as the battle on the river took place. The Confederates planned for an infantry assault, but miscommunication and other problems resulted in it not taking place. The day passed with no significant fighting done by the infantry, although Grant did receive reinforcements, particularly from Fort Henry, where Lew Wallace brought his new division to help tighten the noose around the Confederate works. That night, 2 meetings took place, one before midnight and one right after midnight. The first one saw Floyd, Gideon Pillow, and Simon Bolivar Buckner discuss what to do next. If they waited any longer inside of Donelson, Grant's forces would completely cut them off from Nashville, Tennessee. They had to act. They couldn't remain idle any longer. They needed to escape using the eastern approaches to the fortifications before Grant completely cut them off, and if they stayed on the south side of the Cumberland River, they could make it to Nashville without having to worry about the Union gunboats cutting them off. It was decided they needed to evacuate, but they needed to attack Grant and push his forces back to open up the Forge Road for the escape, and hopefully bloodying Grant enough in the process to prevent a rapid pursuit. The brigade commanders would begin forming their brigades and attack at dawn on February 15th. The second meeting involved the brigade commanders to tell them all at once and make sure everyone knew their roles. The brigade commanders would begin forming their brigades and attack at dawn on February 15th. Most of the troops would move out of the fortifications on the Confederate left, while Buckner used his troops to occupy the entrenchments. It was a bold move, but could pay dividends if successful. The Confederates, though some communication led to delays, assembled outside the works opposing the Union right flank with the intention of driving them west. Amazingly, the Federal troops hadn't detected the massive movement of men. Union General John McClernand on the Union right had placed the brigade of John MacArthur on his flank. MacArthur wasn't part of his division, but sent to him from Charles F. Smith's division on the Union left. It would be MacArthur's brigade that came into contact first with the columns of Gray troops. William Baldwin's small brigade made contact with MacArthur's men. The Federals held a position on Dudley's Hill, giving them an advantage over the attackers. One by one, more rebel brigades came to bear on MacArthur's 3 regiments. Despite the overwhelming numbers in his front, MacArthur held them off for 3 hours, a true testament to the Union brigade commander and his men. It was around 9 a.m. before MacArthur's men finally fell back on McClernand's division. McClernand had repeatedly sent couriers to Grant and the other division commanders requesting reinforcements, but the messages to Grant came back with the same message. Grant would address it when he returned. Grant, thinking that nothing significant would happen that day, went to visit Andrew Foote, about 4 to 5 miles away. McClernand, Wallace, and Smith would be on their own for the moment. McClernand moved his units around to refuse his line to the right to fight back against the approaching rebels, but despite the early success, the Confederate plan wasn't going exactly the way they had hoped. Buckner, in the earthworks, was to attack the Federals in their front, so the flank attack would be much more successful, but Buckner hadn't moved out of the works yet, frustrating the flankers. Charles Cruft's brigade was approaching the right to help stem the rebel tide. Richard Oglesby directed Cruft to his exposed flank, but as the 25th Kentucky deployed, part of the regiment fired for some unknown reason and shot into the back of Oglesby's men. This was too much for most of the regiments, and they retreated, carrying the Kentuckians with them, whose line was busted up from their comrades running through it. Cruft deployed his brigade to the right of the 31st Illinois, which was led by Colonel John A. Logan. The politician-turned-general got wounded as he fought desperately to defend the flank. The approaching rebels overwhelmed their flanks and forced them to reform their lines, but the reformation caused more problems when the 44th Indiana became convinced they were facing the enemy, even though they were behind the 31st. As the Confederate bullets found their mark in the Hoosiers' line, the regiment fired into the backs of the Illinoisans, causing a retreat that took the Indianians as well as the reformed Kentuckians away from the fight. The men who remained at the front couldn't hold out any longer, and they fell back, more victims of the gray tide sweeping over the field. Logan raged as he attempted to reform the line, despite his men running for the rear. One Illinoisan described the irate commander. None of us were anxious to go back just then, and he took his sword, which was made of tin or pewter but silver-plated, and put his foot on it to break it. He was so mad. He beat it nearly double, and as it had no spring in it, it remained in a shape like this. He then waved it over his head and used language which is not proper to put on paper. The Confederates had routed 3 Union brigades under MacArthur, Oglesby, and Cruft, and most importantly, opened up the Forge Road. To maneuver wheeled vehicles, they needed that road in order to make good their escape, but the Union Army was still too close to that escape route, so they would need to press them further in order to make good their evacuation.